After studying this module, you will be able to know what is anthropometry and osteometry and what are various anthropometric and osteometric variations in human population. Before starting with various variations found at anthropometric or osteometric level, let us discuss about the anthropometry. The word anthropometry is derived from Greek word anthropos, which means human, and the word metron, which refers to measure. So, as a whole, it means the measurement of the human individual. An early tool of physical anthropology, it has been used for identification for the purposes of understanding human physical variation. If you see the osteometry, it is the study and measurement of human or animal skeleton, especially in an anthropological or archaeological context. Aspects commonly studied in determining the species of very early skeletons include the length of the femur and other long bones, the capacity of the skull, the shape of the facial features and skull, the shape of the jaw and teeth. Now let us see what are the various anthropometric and osteometric variations amongst the human population. An experienced physical anthropologist ought to be able to determine from the examination of the skeleton about race of the person. That is, whether that person was white, that is a Caucasoid, or black or colored, that is Negroid, or Mongoloid. There are also some especially distinctive races, sub-races, or pupil that are usually identifiable from the skeletal characteristics. If the jaws of the skull are large, the teeth is in perfect occlusion and devoid of any dental caries and other signs of disease. The betting odds are heavily in favor of the individual's primitive or savage status. If we see the skeleton of whites, that is Caucasoids, the postcranial bones of whites are usually heavier, thicker and more massive than those of non-whites, with some individual or group exceptions. Particularly, joints of the long bones in whites are larger, the bones of the wrist and of the tarsus are less rounded and with better defined articular surfaces. White pelvis is considerably wider and more rugged than those of most non-whites. Muscular markings on the bones of whites are likely to be more prominent, partly because these are in considerable major features of the advanced age and civilized whites survive longer than do the bulk of primitive pupils. If we see the skull of whites, especially Europeans, they are most readily recognizable by small jaws, pinched palates and frequently high narrow nasal bones and sharp lower borders of the nasal aperture with well developed nasal spine. The chin eminence is bigger than in most non-whites, partly because the alveolar borders have shrunk more, throwing the bone chin into the prominence. A diagnostic feature of white skulls, more marked in males than in females, is a depression of the nasofrontal suture below the level of convex glabella. The depression of nasion is exaggerated in aboriginal Australian skulls and in the skulls of some Papuans and Melanesians. The brow ridges in whites, again particularly in the males, are bigger and more developed laterally than in Negroid or pure Mongoloid, but Australians they surpass and American Indians at least equal these white races in this particular feature. Correspondingly, receding foreheads are often observed in whites than in Negroid or most pure Mongoloid, but this criteria is not very dependable. On the whole, mastoid processes and styloid processes are likely to be bigger in whites than in non-whites. The external occipital protuberance is often a conical elevation and sometimes a bony hook, whereas a swollen transverse ridge or torus occurs more frequently in Mongoloid, Australoid and American Indians. In the mandible, the genial tubercles are usually better marked in whites than in non-whites. Straight or orthognathoz faces devoid of prognathism are most commonly diagnostic of white racial ancestry. Now we see the skeleton of Negroids or the black races. The most Negroids have slender long bones with rather small articular heads and joint surfaces. Strongly bowed femora with marked pilasters are rare. The pelvis is narrow and high. That of the female is less well differentiated from that of the male than in whites. The bones of the forearm and of the leg are long relative to the bones of the upper segments of their respective limbs. The texture of the Negro skull when in relatively fresh condition seems closer, denser and more ivory-like than the skull texture of whites and Mongoloids. The Negroid face is usually marked by strong alveolar prognathism, a particularly bulging of the jaws in the subnasal region by a poorly developed chin and by the low broad nasal bridge and exaggeratedly broad nasal aperture. The latter usually has dull or indistinct lower borders and rudimentary nasal spine. In adult Negroid, the longitudinal nasal suture is fused or not infrequently obliterated. This fusion is very rare in non-Negroid. The palate and dental arches of the Negroid skull are commonly long and somewhat narrow. The teeth are not especially large, although they exceed in size than those of whites. Often there is a space in the alveolar processes behind the third molars and impacted wisdom tooth are rare in the Negroids. The face of the pure Negro is usually quite short, but mixed Negroid often has long deep faces and jaws. The Negro malars are not ordinarily massive, deep or flaring, but they are more sharply angled than those of most whites. The Negroid orbit tends to be low and rarely is tilted downwards and outwards. The glabella is often as prominent as in whites, who show medium development of this feature. The brow ridges are considerably less marked than whites. We see the development of the skeleton in the Negroid races, the colored races. The typical Negroid forehead is symmetrically rounded from side to side and from front to back it inclines to narrowness and is not very high. In females, the forehead is often bulbous. In the male forehead, a medium frontal ridge or elevation is often seen along the lines of juncture of the two halves of the frontal bone. In the more bulging female forehead, the frontal bossing, one in the middle of each half of the frontal bone, are often conspicuous. The temporal regions of the Negroid crania are long-headed and owe their dolichocephaly principally to the narrowness. An annular or ring-like constriction across the skull just behind the coronal suture is often marked. The occiput is usually protuberant and symmetrically convex. The attachment of neck muscles and ligaments ordinarily are not strongly developed. Now we see the skeleton of Mongoloid. The primary diagnostic feature in the skull is the size and shape of the malar. If you look at the skull from the basal view, you will see that the lower border of the malar or cheekbone consists of a frontal and almost transverse edge and a lateral edge that breaks away from the frontal edge at a very sharp angle, nearly right angle. This angulation is in strong contrast to the ordinary streamlined white malar viewed from below, which presents a smooth curving around from the front to the side. The Negroid malar is often intermediate in angulation but nearer to the white form. The entire medial part of the mongoloid malar is pushed forward so that the portion of it that forms the lower rim of the orbit is often advanced, directed forwards than the upper orbital rim. The body of the malar is also deeper, broader and more massive than in the white or negroid. Both anterior and lateral flares are inescapable. The forward thrust of the malar contributes to the flat-faced appearance of the mongoloid skull. In conformity with this architecture, the suborbital or the canine fossa is often very slight in mongoloid or may be entirely absent also. It is usually fairly well developed in whites and often deep in negroids. This is one of the best diagnostic features of the mongoloid skulls. The root of the nose is usually very flat and broad, but the top of the nasal bones themselves may be quite narrow. Almost always, the nasal root of the mongoloid is deeply depressed below the nasion region, and this concavity may carry down to the middle of the bridge or may give way to a convexity. The nasal bridge is nearly always low in pure mongoloid, but it is not wide nor is the nasal aperture. The latter is inclined to infantile conformation with dull borders and a small nasal spine. The mongoloid facial skeletons usually show some alveolar prognathism of both jaws, but not nearly so much as usual in the negroid or the australoid skulls. The palate and dental arcades are likely to be short and wide. Correspondingly, the lower jaws are ordinarily wide with flaring posterior angles and somewhat short anteroposteriorly. The chin eminence is better developed than in typical negroid, but not so prominent as in most whites. The shovel-shaped incisors are certainly characteristic of mongoloids, but they may occur in other races also. Scientist Vidya-mitra regards the bony swellings on the palate and on the inside of the mandibular are characteristic mongoloid features. They are most common in Eskimo, who are undoubtedly mongoloids. However, they occur in non-mongoloids too. The pterygoid plates of the mongoloid skull are likely to be large and flaring, especially in strong jaws with everted gonial angles. The part of the tympanic plate that forms the back wall of the glenoid fossa often exhibits irregular holes or gaps due to imperfect ossification. These dehiscences are especially common in immature or female skull. On the whole, mongoloid glenoid fossae are likely to be shallower than those of the whites. The frontal region of the mongoloid skull is usually not provided with large brow-ridge or a prominent glabella. Characteristically, it presents rather flat surface sloping gently to moderately. The forehead is neither low nor it is narrow, except in comparison with the great breadth of the brain case across the parietals. The temporal region is rarely full or bulging, even in the round heads. The brachycephalic mongoloid skull tend to be more wedge-shaped or sphenoidal than brachycephalic white skulls, which are often more nearly globular. The difference of appearance results from the lesser breadth of the mongoloid frontal in comparison with the maximum breadth of the skull back on the parietals, from the flatter temporal region of the mongoloid and the lesser convexity of the occipital region. The mongoloid skulls often present a ridge pole-like elevation in the sagittal region, where the parietal bones meet in the center. However, this sagittal elevation occurs often in absolutely non-mongoloid crania, both long-headed and round-headed. Again, the scientists Vidya-mitra regard it as a mongoloid feature. Flat occipits and marked occipital tori occur together maximally in brachycephalic mongoloids. To summarize this topic, the anthropometry means the measurement of the human individual whereas osteometry is the study and measurement of human or animal skeleton. The skeletal features of various races, that is Caucasoids, whites, the Negroids, the colored one, the blacks, and Mongoloids differ markedly with each other. By having proper examination of the skeleton, a trained anthropologist can differentiate between various races.